When we picture the Eastern Front, we often see a stark contrast: German technological efficiency versus Soviet human mass. This was certainly the prevailing view held by the Wehrmacht in 1941 and 1942. To the weary German soldier freezing in the trenches, the Red Army appeared to be a terrifying, relentless steamroller, endlessly supplied with fresh, often poorly equipped men thrown into the fight by ruthless command. They saw waves of infantry, poorly maintained T-34s, and a seemingly endless supply of replacements, which fueled both their own confidence in their perceived technological superiority and a chilling contempt for the enemy. This narrative of brute force, while partially true in the early chaos, completely missed the underlying and catastrophic weakness that nearly broke the Red Army: logistics. The German soldier focused on the man because he never saw the machine that was supposed to be supporting him. The German miscalculation was rooted in this perception of a technologically primitive foe. Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of the Soviet Union, was predicated on the belief that the Soviet industrial base was too crude, and that the country would crumble before its vast resources could be effectively mobilized. In reality, the Soviet Union did struggle mightily in 1941. Divisions were frequently stranded, stalled not only by German resistance, but by tanks running out of fuel and commanders losing contact due to a profound lack of reliable communication equipment. Their limited logistics relied heavily on horse-drawn carts, the Wehrmacht's own Achilles heel, which struggled desperately with the sheer distance and the notorious, roadless Russian mud, the Rasputitsa. This operational friction confirmed for the German High Command that the Red Army was an uncoordinated, brute force army, predictable in its reliance on sheer numbers.
But a transformation began to take hold. Starting in late 1942, the Red Army's movements began to change. Soviet divisions were moving faster, maintaining contact over greater distances, and exploiting breakthroughs with a devastating new efficiency. To the German soldier and general alike, this seemed to be an evolution in Soviet tactics, or perhaps just the successful relocation of Soviet factories beginning to bear fruit. They focused on the improved T-34s and the sheer volume of artillery. They were still focused on the visible battlefield elements, utterly missing the secret technological pipeline flowing into Soviet ports: Lend-Lease. It was a term few on the German front line would ever hear, yet it represented an act of American and British industrial might that was about to turn the Red Army's fatal logistical weakness into its greatest, most mobile strength. The impact of this aid would be staggering. Before Lend-Lease, the Soviet Union was a logistical cripple. After Lend-Lease, it possessed a fully mechanized supply train that allowed its tank armies to keep pace with the blitzkrieg tactics the Germans pioneered. It granted them reliable, real-time command and control that turned scattered units into a cohesive fighting machine. In essence, the Red Army provided the courage, the sacrifice, and the final push to Berlin, but the United States and Britain provided the chassis, the engine, and the nervous system for that final victory. This is the story of the equipment the German soldiers were looking for but never saw: the unsung heroes of the Eastern Front, the American-made trucks and radios.
The most critical component requested by the Soviet government under Lend-Lease was simple: trucks. Their initial logistical system was a nightmare, relying heavily on horses, captured vehicles, and hastily adapted civilian machinery. To mechanize and modernize the Red Army, they needed a robust, standardized vehicle fleet. The U.S. delivered in staggering numbers. The workhorse of this effort was the Studebaker US-6 truck. While the U.S. Army sometimes found it less rugged than their preferred GMC Deuce and a Half, it was a transformative piece of equipment for the Soviets. Over 100,000 of these 2.5-ton studies were shipped to the USSR. For context, this single model represented nearly a third of all medium and heavy trucks the Soviet Union possessed during the entire war. The difference between the Studebaker and the typical German or early Soviet vehicle was its crucial feature: all-wheel drive. The German Wehrmacht was constantly hampered by the deep, trackless Russian mud, the Rasputitsa, and relied on hundreds of thousands of horses to pull their supplies and artillery. The Studebaker, however, was engineered for off-road heavy-duty work. It was rugged, simple to maintain, and crucially, it arrived with a steady supply of spare parts and high-quality tires, materials the besieged industrial complex struggled desperately to produce in sufficient quantity. This reliable, powerful vehicle gave the Red Army a mobility advantage that the Germans had never anticipated and could not match outside of their own elite, fully mechanized divisions. This influx of American automotive engineering did more than just move supplies. It was the key to unlocking the Soviets' deep battle doctrine. This doctrine required breakthrough exploitation, a rapid deep thrust into the enemy's rear to sever supply lines and surround formations. Without reliable, fast, and fuel-carrying transport, this was impossible. With the Studebaker, Soviet tank armies could finally break through German lines and keep moving, carrying their own fuel, ammunition, and supporting infantry. They no longer had to stop and wait for horse-drawn supply carts to catch up, a delay that had cost them dearly in 1941 and 1942. The American truck was literally the engine that drove the Red Army's swift enveloping maneuvers of 1944. But the Lend-Lease trucks weren't just about the Studebaker. The Soviet Union also received nearly 50,000 Jeeps and Dodge command cars, providing officers with fast, reliable, all-terrain reconnaissance and command vehicles. The fleet was also used to tow crucial artillery, including the deadly Katyusha rocket launchers, nicknamed Stalin's organs. The mobility granted by this foreign-supplied fleet was so effective that when Marshal Georgy Zhukov, the man who ultimately defeated the Wehrmacht, was asked what factors were critical to victory, he put American trucks right at the top of the list. The German soldiers saw the result, the relentless, mobile enemy, but never the American industrial commitment that made it possible. If the trucks provided the body of the modern Red Army, the radios provided the nervous system. Before Lend-Lease, the Red Army's communication was medieval. The Wehrmacht's success in 1940 and 1941 was built on superior, reliable radio communication, the core of Blitzkrieg. Conversely, many Soviet tank units, especially in 1941, had no radio at all, relying instead on flags, hand signals, or runners, methods easily disrupted and far too slow for maneuver warfare. This meant command and control was slow, brittle, and often disintegrated during fast-moving offensives, turning potential victories into bloody stalemates, further reinforcing the German view of the Soviets as uncoordinated. Lend-Lease dramatically corrected this fatal flaw by supplying the Soviet Union with hundreds of thousands of radios. Two models were particularly transformative: the SCR 536 handy-talkie and the SCR 300 walkie-talkie. The SCR 300 was a reliable, backpack-mounted, frequency-modulated or FM radio. Crucially, it was rugged and simple for a Soviet soldier to operate, even with minimal training. This technology allowed platoon and company commanders to finally maintain real-time contact with each other and with their battalions. For the first time, Soviet formations could rapidly react to changing battlefield conditions, coordinate joint arms maneuvers, and call in artillery with speed and precision. The impact on the field was immediate and profound. German commanders began noticing a chilling new trend. Soviet attacks were better coordinated, more cohesive, and most importantly, far more resilient to German counterattacks. The element of surprise and rapid maneuver, which the Germans believed was their sole domain, was now being executed by the Red Army. Beyond the handheld and backpack radios, the Soviet Union also received tons of high-quality field telephone wire and advanced signal equipment for their headquarters. This built a robust, layered communications network that turned the Red Army's command structure from a liability into a formidable asset, capable of commanding vast fronts with unprecedented coordination. The success of the great Soviet offensives like Operation Bagration in 1944, which utterly destroyed Germany's Army Group Center, was not just about having more tanks and men. It was about the ability to command those tanks and men in real time. The radios ensured that when the armor punched through, the motorized infantry, carried by Studebakers, and the supporting artillery could follow instantly and seamlessly. The German soldiers saw only the relentless push of the Red Army, but the unseen voice of command carried by American signals technology was the true orchestrator of their doom. The Germans were fighting a force that was now every bit as technologically linked, if not more so, than their own, but they never realized the source of that sudden, devastating cohesion. The story of Lend-Lease is incomplete without acknowledging the immense, harrowing effort required to deliver it. The sheer logistics of getting hundreds of thousands of trucks and tons of equipment to the Soviet front lines were an epic struggle.
The two main routes were the perilous Arctic convoys and the monumental Persian corridor. The Arctic route, sailing into Murmansk and Archangel, was a gauntlet of German U-boats, Luftwaffe strikes, and deadly freezing temperatures. Many ships and thousands of British, American, and Soviet sailors were lost ensuring the delivery of material. They sailed straight through the heart of German naval operations, paying a terrifying human price for every single crate of supplies. The second route, the Persian corridor, was less glamorous but delivered far more in total tonnage. It required the joint invasion and occupation of Iran by British and Soviet forces to secure the route. It became a colossal multinational logistical undertaking. American and British engineers worked alongside Iranian laborers to upgrade ports, lay new railway tracks, and establish a vast trans-Iranian trucking route. It became a highway of American-built vehicles driven by Persian, Indian, and Soviet drivers, pushing goods from the Persian Gulf north toward the Caspian Sea. This operation alone delivered millions of tons of material, including the critical final assembly of many of the trucks themselves.
This constant, massive flow of material became the German High Command's most critical blind spot. They focused on the visible sinkings of the Arctic convoys, celebrating every U-boat success, but they failed to comprehend the total volume and transformative quality of the supplies flowing through the Persian corridor. They were obsessed with sinking battleships and bombing factories, completely underestimating the strategic value of the simple truck, the radio, and the raw materials quietly flowing into the Soviet interior. They saw the Soviet soldier and the Soviet tank as the primary enemy, missing the fact that the true war was being won on the supply line that stretched across the globe. Beyond the vehicles and communications, Lend-Lease was a comprehensive support system that provided fuel, food, and raw materials. The Soviets received nearly 1.8 million tons of high-octane aviation fuel, essential for their re-equipped Air Force, along with millions of tons of industrial machinery, explosives, and vital rail cars. This allowed the Soviet economy to dedicate its limited production to tanks and artillery, while the Allies provide the necessary backbone. The cumulative effect was that the Red Army finally had the necessary tools to fully utilize its immense manpower and industrial output. The German soldier was not just fighting an endless supply of men, he was fighting the industrial capacity of the entire Western world, a force that was simply unstoppable. As the war turned decisively against the Wehrmacht in 1944, the German soldiers' initial contempt for the uncoordinated Soviet steamroller was replaced by a grim, desperate realization. They were not just facing men, they were facing a force that could maneuver, communicate, and resupply with a speed and efficiency that seemed impossible just 2 years prior. We can see this change reflected in the battle reports. During Operation Bagration, the Soviet offensive that shattered Army Group Center, the speed of the advance, sometimes over 25 miles a day, was fundamentally powered by Studebakers carrying fuel and infantry, and coordinated by walkie-talkies. The German generals had learned to fear the Russian winter and the Russian man, but they had fundamentally failed to respect the American machine. For the German High Command, the greatest insult and irony was the direct evidence of Lend-Lease on the battlefield. Captured German intelligence officers often expressed shock when examining the technical specifications of Soviet field radios, realizing they were U.S.-made. German supply units, desperately scavenging for fuel, would sometimes find abandoned Studebaker trucks that still functioned perfectly, a painful reminder of the robust, simple design they lacked. It was a war-winning strategy of outsourced logistics. The Soviet Union focused on what it did best, producing tanks and artillery, while the Western Allies filled the critical gap in mobility and communications, a gap that the Soviets simply could not have closed themselves in time. The myth of the purely manpower victory is a deeply ingrained and persistent one, rooted in wartime propaganda from both sides. It served the Soviet narrative to emphasize the heroism and sacrifice of their people alone, and it served the German narrative to downplay the industrial might of the combined Allied war effort. But the historical record is clear. Marshal Georgy Zhukov himself later acknowledged the crucial role of the aid. He stated plainly, "We received very large supplies. We would not have been able to keep going with our own resources." The sheer scale of the aid, which included 400,000 tons of gunpowder and 15 million pairs of boots, was not a luxury. It was the scaffolding that allowed the Red Army to stand firm and then advance. The German soldiers who fought the Red Army in 1944 and 1945 did indeed face the vast, terrifying force of Soviet manpower. But what they failed to grasp was that this force was finally operating at its maximum potential, no longer crippled by logistical breakdowns. The Red Army they encountered was a truly modern, mechanized, and coordinated military machine. The raw courage and immense sacrifice were Soviet, but the mobility, the voice of command, and the engine of relentless supply that drove the final decisive victory on the Eastern Front were gifts from the West. The German army was defeated not just by Russian grit, but by a global industrial alliance they never saw coming. By the summer of 1944, the Germans felt relatively secure in Belarus. Their massive formation, Army Group Center, had established deep, fixed defenses based on the assumption that any Soviet offensive would still rely on massed infantry assaults and face the same logistical hurdles as before. They believed the vast distances and the poor road network were their allies, guaranteeing that even a Soviet breakthrough would quickly run out of steam, giving them time to bring up reserves. This complacency, rooted in their persistent belief in the Soviet steamroller myth, was about to be brutally shattered. The Soviets had learned from the Blitzkrieg and were now ready to execute it better. The Soviets, however, prepared for a different kind of war. Their plan, Operation Bagration, was a complex, multi-axis maneuver designed not for frontal combat, but for deep penetration and encirclement. It required tank armies and mechanized infantry to advance faster than the Germans could react, sometimes covering 25 to 30 miles a day. Without the American-supplied Studebaker trucks, this speed would have been impossible. The trucks were essential for carrying the high-octane fuel, artillery shells, and the motorized infantry required to secure the flanks of the rapidly moving armor. The Germans prepared for a slugfest. They received a fully mechanized, fluid disaster. During the initial days of Bagration, Soviet armor punched holes in the German line. But the critical difference from earlier offensives was exploitation. In 1941, this kind of breakthrough would stall within a day or two as tanks ran dry. In 1944, the supply columns kept pace. Long convoys of Studebaker US-6s followed immediately behind the fighting troops, ensuring continuous fuel and ammunition supply. These were the ghost fleets that the German High Command never factored into their defensive calculations. The trucks were not targets for glory, they were the unseen supply chain that negated the great distance the Germans relied upon. But logistics wasn't just about moving the supplies, it was about moving the men. The Soviet tank armies were often accompanied by motorized rifle divisions who rode directly on the trucks. This infantry was critical for securing the flanks of the armor and neutralizing pockets of German resistance. When the German command belatedly tried to form new defensive hedgehogs, these Soviet motorized units, carried by their American trucks, simply drove around them and severed their lines of retreat and supply. The speed of the encirclements, not the brutality, was what broke Army Group Center. It was a logistical defeat, and the key piece of equipment, the all-wheel drive Studebaker, was foreign-made. Hand in hand with mobility was command and control. Bagration was a complex, four-front operation involving hundreds of thousands of men moving simultaneously. This level of coordination would have been unthinkable for the Red Army in 1941. The vast network of Lend-Lease radios, from the small SCR-300 walkie-talkies at the platoon level to larger command radios at the division level, allowed Soviet generals to maintain a real-time picture of the chaotic, rapidly evolving battlefield. If a German unit was spotted moving into a gap, a Soviet commander could instantly reroute an exploitation force. The Germans, on the other hand, suffered from continuous communication breakdown. They were trying to coordinate fragmented, retreating units using overloaded, vulnerable communication lines. The Soviets were operating with a robust, clear, and reliable American-made network. This disparity was lethal. It meant that while German units were fighting hard, they were fighting alone and in the dark, unaware that the entire force structure around them had collapsed. The voice of command, clear and decisive over the static, was one of the secret weapons that allowed the Red Army to execute the deep, decisive encirclements that led to the capture or destruction of 28 German divisions, a catastrophe that truly sealed the Wehrmacht's fate on the Eastern Front.
Ultimately, Operation Bagration wasn't just a testament to Soviet courage. It was a testament to the seamless integration of Western industrial power with Soviet fighting will. The German soldiers saw the Red Army's seemingly endless reserves of men, but the true force that broke them was the hidden logistics train and the unseen communication network. This was the moment the myth of the steamroller died, replaced by the terrifying reality of a fully motorized, highly coordinated, and inexhaustibly supplied modern army. As Marshal Zhukov admitted, the war could not have been won without the aid. The German military believed they were fighting only the Soviet Union. In reality, on the Eastern Front, the Western Allies were a constant, invisible partner, providing the essential backbone of mobility and coordination that turned a defensive struggle into a final, unstoppable offensive. This leads us to our final analysis, the long-term historical impact of Lend-Lease and why the story is still so often overlooked. The impact of Lend-Lease extended far beyond the battlefield. It touched the Soviet economy and the very survival of its people. While the trucks and radios were the weapons of victory, the raw materials were the lifelines. The Soviets received nearly 2.7 million tons of petroleum products, over 300,000 tons of aluminum, and enormous quantities of copper, rubber, and high-quality steel. These were resources the Soviet Union had lost access to when its vital industrial regions were overrun in 1941. This aid didn't replace Soviet output, but it provided the critical supplements needed to keep their own factories running and to produce the tanks and planes that the U.S. didn't provide. Without American aluminum, Soviet aircraft production would have been severely crippled. The human side of this aid is often minimized, but was profoundly important for morale and survival. The Soviets received over 4.5 million tons of foodstuffs. The most famous was Tushanka, or American canned meat, affectionately nicknamed second belly by Soviet soldiers. This constant, high-protein food source significantly supplemented the meager Soviet rations. On the front lines, a well-fed soldier is a more effective soldier. Furthermore, 15 million pairs of high-quality military boots were shipped, enough to outfit the entire front line several times over. When German troops were often freezing in poor-quality footwear, the Soviet soldier had durable American-made protection. These simple, non-glamorous items were the foundation of resilience. Furthermore, the U.S. provided an entire infrastructure to the Soviet Union. The rail network, which was crucial for moving both men and Lend-Lease goods, was utterly dependent on Western support. The U.S. supplied nearly 2,000 locomotives and over 11,000 rail cars, along with the heavy machinery and engineering equipment needed to repair bridges and lay tracks. This was vital because the Soviet rail gauge was different from the German one, requiring the Soviets to frequently adapt and rebuild. The American rolling stock allowed the Soviets to maintain a rapid tempo of operational movement over the vast Russian interior, enabling them to shift massive forces quickly for offensives like Bagration and the drive toward Berlin. The combined effect of these supplies was an economic lifeline. While Lend-Lease accounted for only about 4% of Soviet GDP during the war, historians often argue that it delivered 100% of the critically missing logistical components and the essential raw materials required at the moment of maximum strategic vulnerability. Without the aluminum, the planes are grounded. Without the high-octane fuel, the tanks stop. Without the trucks, the infantry can't keep up. And without the radios, the entire maneuver collapses. It was a precise, timely injection of industrial capability that allowed the Soviet Union to survive the darkest years and then leverage its vast manpower to win the war. The victory was forged by Soviet blood, but it was powered by American steel and logistics.
If Lend-Lease was so critical to the Soviet victory, why is the story of the Studebaker and the walkie-talkie so rarely told? The answer lies in the immediate post-war political climate, the rise of the Cold War. After 1945, the Soviet Union quickly moved to minimize and suppress the record of Western aid. Acknowledging the vital role of American industrial might would undermine the heroic narrative of the Soviet people's sole struggle against fascism, a narrative essential for solidifying internal Soviet political power and promoting the superiority of the communist system. Soviet war histories downplayed Lend-Lease, often reducing it to a footnote about minor supplies. They claimed the aid was merely 4% of the total war effort, a figure that, while numerically accurate in monetary terms, completely obscured the strategic value of the specific items delivered. For example, while the USSR produced many of its own tanks, American Lend-Lease was the source of 2/3 of all Soviet railroad track and over 90% of their railway explosives. These critical choke point items were impossible for the battered Soviet economy to produce rapidly, making the aid strategically irreplaceable regardless of the overall financial percentage.
This deliberate suppression was compounded in the West, though for different reasons. During the Cold War, the U.S. narrative focused heavily on its direct contributions in the Pacific and Western Europe. Highlighting the Soviet reliance on American aid was used as a point of ideological superiority, a way to demonstrate the failure of the communist economic system. While this was historically accurate, it tended to frame the aid as merely a charity, rather than as a mutually essential, coordinated war effort. This focus on political point scoring often overshadowed the true, complex historical truth of the partnership. It wasn't until the collapse of the Soviet Union in the 1990s and the opening of Soviet archives that the full scope and strategic depth of Lend-Lease could be acknowledged by historians on both sides. The testimony of Soviet generals like Zhukov, who were finally free to speak honestly, confirmed what the logistics suggested. The war was a unified Allied effort, with American industry and logistics serving as the silent strategic partner on the Eastern Front. The initial German soldier's mistake, believing he was fighting only manpower, was perpetuated by political dogma for decades. Our ability to tell this story now is a triumph of historical truth over Cold War narrative.
So, we return to our initial image, the German soldier facing the relentless Soviet advance. His misconception that he was fighting only a wave of men was his ultimate downfall. He saw the raw manpower in the Soviet resolve, but he missed the American engine and the British nerve center that made that power function. The victory on the Eastern Front was not a miracle of sheer numbers. It was a victory of modern, mobile logistics over static, horse-drawn supply chains. It was a war won by Studebaker trucks maintaining the tempo and SCR 300 radios maintaining the command. For modern viewers, this story offers a crucial lesson. The wars of the 20th century were decided not just by courage, but by industrial capacity and strategic logistics. The fate of nations was often sealed on the factory floors of Detroit and the docks of the Persian Gulf, far from the roar of the guns. When we fully acknowledge the role of Lend-Lease, we gain a far more accurate, nuanced, and respectful understanding of the immense coordinated effort required to defeat fascism. It elevates the story from a simple narrative of brute force to a complex testament to global cooperation under extreme pressure. In closing, the memory of the German soldier who scoffed at the Soviets' primitive war machine serves as a perfect historical metaphor. He saw the face of his enemy, but never understood the hidden infrastructure that made that face so terrifyingly effective. He was defeated by a mechanized, coordinated, and ceaselessly supplied army that was, thanks to Lend-Lease, truly fighting a global war. The Red Army provided the ultimate sacrifice, but the power of Lend-Lease trucks and radios provided the undeniable, unseen force that drove the final journey to Berlin, making it one of the most strategically significant, yet overlooked, factors of the Second World War.